Welcome to Real Rockford Files for tales of the paranormal, supernatural, and the flat-out unbelievable. Today I'll be sharing ghost stories from Iowa. Let's get into it. Story 1. My cousins came over 3 years ago from Iowa to visit us and decided to tell us about a story when they caught a ghost on camera and some dog statues that moved on their own. They said they got them from a yard sale or a flea market. I forget, but the original owners of them didn't want them anymore, so they started to sell them because something terrified them so bad. I have been to his house and seen his dog statues, and I always felt some odd bad vibe and energy about them. Even my siblings felt it too while they were around them. I sometimes felt like they stared at me, and even everyone agreed. One of my cousins said that one of them creeped her out because she swears one moved his head to look at her and then back to normal. Then one day my aunt actually caught one moving whenever she looked away and back. She decided to throw them away in a plastic bag, and when my cousin asked what was in the bag, she was like, "Don't touch them, it's the dog statues. I'm throwing them out now since they scare me and give off a bad vibe." They also said that they heard barks and growls at night when they had them. I felt really spooked when they told me that, like those statues were definitely possessed either by a dog or a demon or a ghost that is attached to them, but they're gone now. Those statues really looked realistic. Story 2. Around the year 2010, a friend of mine called me asking if I would be interested in house sitting and watching his 2 cats as well for about a month as he was going into the hospital for medical treatments. I accepted immediately. When I first entered his place, I felt a heaviness but kept that silent. He gave me a tour of the place. I refused the basement and his bedroom. Both had a horrible sense to me. After he left, I proceeded to work on a list of things I wanted to help him out with in his home. Later on, I worked on settling a bit in the spare room he had for me to stay in. One day, as I was organizing some of my things in the spare room, both the cats came bolting in by me and hid under the bed. I knew they got wound up, but that was fear. So I looked up towards the living room where they had run, and there walking across the floor in the sun's rays from the window was a pair of man's legs. Just the legs. They had mechanics pants on, plus old boots. They walked slowly towards the front door. I didn't leave the room for a while. Now, I'm not afraid of ghosts or spirits, but this one had a very uneasy feel to him. I'm guessing this may be what I sensed from the start. After my friend returned from the hospital, we sat and chatted about what happened, which brought up the basement in his bedroom. He himself was very hesitant to go into the basement. As for his room, he indicated that when he moved in there were strange writings all over the walls, which he painted over. I sure wish he'd taken pictures. Story 3. This experience dates back 20 years ago to when I was only 8 years old. Still, I can remember it better than I remember the hike I took with my dog yesterday. First, to help paint a mental picture, this occurred on an old farm in Iowa, just outside of Sioux Center. If anyone knows where that is, my older brother and I had gone over to spend the night at a friend's farm. They have 4 kids in total. One brother my age, one brother my brother's age, one younger sister, and another older brother that wasn't at the house often. Specifically, he wasn't at the house this night. Fast forward to the nighttime. My friend and I had gone upstairs, and my brother and his friends stayed downstairs in the living room with sleeping bags. The sister and their parents in their own rooms on the main level of the house as well. It was almost 1 a.m. My friend and I still hadn't gone to sleep. We were just staying up late talking, being kids. Then things got creepy really fast. We both stopped talking and started listening into the hallway at the same time. Someone was pacing up and down the hallway with some very heavy footsteps. We were kids and I'd never experienced anything supernatural at the time, so that thought never crossed my mind. I asked my friend if it could be his oldest brother for any reason. He assured me he wasn't home, so I sat by the door and waited until the footsteps were walking away from our room. I creaked the door open to see nothing in the hallway. The footsteps also stopped. We were both understandably spooked, but I wasn't happy with just closing the door and calling it a night. Even though there was no way someone could have hidden time for me to not see them, I had to be sure, so I convinced my friend to go check it out with me. We left the room and down the hall toward where we last heard the footsteps going. There were maybe 5 steps down until the staircase took a 90-degree turn to the main floor. As you went down the first few steps, there was a window facing you. Most farms and acreages have one main yard light, and theirs was throwing enough light through this window to be able to see our way down the steps. Of course, I had to go first. Even though my friend was a good-sized farm boy and I was skin and bones, we crept down the stairs slowly and quietly, having no idea what we were in for. As soon as my foot touched the last step, something significantly taller than me ran right in front of us, knocking me back into my friend up on the stairs. Its footsteps were loud, like it was at a dead sprint. Even though it was only inches from us, neither one of us saw anything. It came from the left and ran to our right. The only thing to our left was the living room, where my brother and his friends were sleeping. Whatever it was standing over top of them while they slept. My buddy had enough. He ran back upstairs to his room. I wanted one last look before I followed him. I grabbed the hand railing and leaned out to let my eyes adjust to the dark a bit more. I saw my brother and his friends sleeping in their sleeping bags to my left, and when I looked to my right where the thing ran off to, I saw something else in the yard. Through the windows I could see a man walking. He was walking underneath the main yard light so I could see him clearly. He had tattered clothes on, a baseball cap, and a big sack slung over his shoulder that was full of whatever your imagination can think of. Other than the fact that it was 1 a.m, this man seemed strange because his clothes, skin, and even the bag over his shoulder were all a glowing gray color. That's when I decided I'd seen enough and ran back to my friend's room. First thing I did was look out his window, which faced the same direction that I'd seen this man outside. He was in the middle of the most open part of their yard when I saw him downstairs. However, from the upstairs window, there was no one outside. This homeless-looking man with a giant sack over his shoulder either set a sprinting record across the yard to hide, or simply vanished underneath the yard light. I've since experienced my fair share of paranormal events, sometimes going out looking for them, but I'll never forget the first encounter I had out at that farmhouse. Story 4. I have a lot of encounters from ghosts, but this one was a little different. Different because I'm not sure what exactly was encountered, but I'm hoping maybe someone can read this and shed a little light on this experience. So this was when I was probably about 17. I was hanging out with my boyfriend at the time and one of his friends. Now, one thing to put out there is that his friend was a pretty outdoorsy kind of guy. He wasn't scared of much. He grew up hunting and was always out exploring the woods at all hours. Living in a small town with a lot of parks and surrounded by wooded areas, there wasn't a lot to do, so exploring the woods was a typical thing for really any of us to do. I never used to be afraid of the woods until after this experience. This particular night, his friend decided that he wanted to go spotlight hunting. Yes, illegal, but we were kids and had no idea. We drove out to an area on a gravel road in my boyfriend's car. There used to be a bridge that went across the river, but it was burnt and eventually torn down, so it was closed off, and the end of the gravel had become overgrown with grass, weeds, and such. There's a tall bridge on the distance. Actually, it's a bridge our little town is very well known for, as it has a lot of history. We were out there miles away from town and from any houses. We found a place to pull over near the end of the gravel, and my boyfriend and his friend grabbed the rifle out of the trunk and their flashlight. Me being an animal lover, I didn't feel like taking part, so I chose to stay in the car. Before my boyfriend took off into the field, he told me to give them 15 minutes, and if they didn't come back, I could take his car and leave them. With that, they disappeared into the dark. So there I was, sitting in his car. There was a metal railing in front of the car that we had pulled up to, which the guys had to climb over. On both sides of the car there was tall grass, taller than the car. It was a bit spooky, but I tried to keep my mind busy. I turned the radio on and waited. 15 minutes went by, and they still weren't back. I hadn't heard any gunshots, so I figured maybe they just weren't having any luck. Then I get this weird feeling, the feeling of being watched, enough to make the hairs on your neck stand up. I tried to play it off as my nerves. I look out my window to the right, and I see the tall grass moving. I told myself it was the wind. I look out the driver's side window. The grass over there stood still. I've seen enough horror movies to know that I didn't want to look out the right window again. Ignorance is bliss, right? I look down at my phone and do everything I can to not look up. scared I might see something I didn't want to see. Then something hit the back of the car, pretty hard. I looked back, but with the tint and the darkness, it was impossible to see anything. So I checked the locks to make sure I was safe and turned up the radio. The knocking on the trunk and back window continued on and off. At this point, it had been an hour since they left, and I was hoping it was just them trying to play a joke on me. I knew I couldn't leave them out there, and there was no way I was getting out of the car. So there I sat, trying to ignore whatever was out there. The knock soon turned to shaking the car. I shrank down in my seat and just kept my eyes on my phone, waiting for the guys to get back. After about 15 minutes, the banging stopped and I was left in silence for about another 15 minutes when I hear the guys yelling. I sat up, flipped on the headlights to see my boyfriend, who had never touched a gun in his life, running towards the car, cradling the rifle in his arms, and vaulting over the metal railing. His friend came running soon after. I unlocked the doors and my boyfriend jumped in the driver's seat, throwing the gun in the back seat where his friend was scrambling to get in, yelling, "Go, go, go!" He quickly backed out, and off we sped down the gravel road. My boyfriend's face was filled with terror, and he starts yelling at his friend, "What the hell was that, man?" His friend is looking out the back windows, terrified, and exclaims, "It's following us." I was both scared and confused. I kept asking him what they were talking about and what happened, but they were too busy trying to calm down. We sped as fast as his car could go back towards town. Once it was clear we were safe, I asked again what happened, only to be told they didn't want to talk about it. Whatever it was, it had scared them more than I'd ever seen someone scared before. We eventually get back into town and pull up to his friend's house. We all sat there in silence for a minute. Both guys looked almost paralyzed, trying to figure out what they had seen. His friend finally spoke, admitting that after whatever they encountered, he was scared to even be home alone. Reluctantly, he got out of the car, grabbed his rifle, and headed inside. I questioned my boyfriend for the next several days, but he always got a weird look on his face and shook his head like he didn't believe it himself. It was apparent I would never know, and I guess a part of me was okay with that, so I stopped asking, and life went on. Okay, so now 9 years later, and I finally got the answer. Like most high school relationships, my boyfriend from back then had been broken up for a long time, and I'm actually married now with 2 kids, and one on the way. Well, it just so happens that my husband had this guy start working with him at work. It took a couple weeks and on-the-job stories from my husband to realize that this guy was the friend of my boyfriend all those years ago. I decided to open up to my husband and tell him about this horrifying experience we all had back then. Well, my husband is a big fan of a podcast called Dogman Encounters. He told me that a lot of the guests on the show had similar experiences that I did while I was in that car, that they would hear banging on the car and it would shake almost like it was trying to lure them out. I suggested that maybe text the guy that he worked with, the friend of my ex, and ask him about that night. He did, and the response was not what I was expecting. He got a reply, the guy explaining how that night haunts him. He told about how they were out in the field, not having much luck. They heard a whole bunch of birds in the grass suddenly take flight, making a ruckus, and gave the guys a bit of a jump. They went over to the area with the flashlight on, and that's when they saw him. He said he was unusually tall and very skinny and lanky, as well as very pale. It was odd enough to see anyone out there at the time of night, let alone being out in a large field lined with forest. He just didn't belong. He then went on to say that the weirdest thing about this guy was his voice. It was very abnormal and unexpectedly high-pitched, like a child. What did the guy say? Well, this is the part that still sends shivers down my spine. Apparently, he said, "You might want to check on that girl you left back in that car." This friend described how they ran back through the field, across the ditch, and back to the car. He said they were running as fast as they could, and this guy was running parallel with them, but through the wooded area, a much harder route, and yet he was keeping perfect pace with them. The trees and terrain didn't slow him at all as they all sprinted back to me in the car. That's when we had started speeding back home. He said when he looked back, he saw the guys step over the metal barrier next to the road. They had to vault to climb over it, but this guy stepped over it like it was nothing. So here I am. My story is finally concluded after 9 years. Although I've tried researching similar encounters, I can't find anything. The only thing I know for sure is whatever that was, it wasn't human. I don't know if it was a ghost, a mystery of nature, or what. So I guess that I'm here for is to find out if anyone has heard or had any personal experience with something like this. I'm terrified to go back to that place, even in the daylight. Any ideas would be greatly appreciated. Thank you. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories. Hope you enjoyed.